"Open the safe and 100 memos will be yours," joked the billionaire, but the poor girl surprised him. "Before we continue, please comment on which city you are watching from." The 42nd floor of the Chrysler building hummed with tension as Farid al-Zahra stared at the impenetrable steel door of his private vault. For 3 hours, his team of the world's most expensive security specialists had tried everything: advanced algorithms, thermal imaging, even calling the Swiss manufacturer directly. Nothing worked. The electronic lock remained stubbornly sealed, protecting millions of dollars and sensitive business documents that Farid desperately needed for a merger deadline in just 2 hours. "Sir, we've exhausted all conventional methods," announced Marcus, the lead technician, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the air conditioning. His team of 5 experts in tailored suits looked defeated, their high-tech equipment scattered across the marble floor like expensive paperweights. Farid al-Zahra, heir to one of the Middle East's largest oil fortunes and owner of a business empire spanning 3 continents, had never felt so powerless. At 38, he commanded respect in boardrooms from Dubai to Wall Street, yet a simple electronic lock was making him look like a fool in front of his own employees. The irony burned. A man who could buy entire city blocks couldn't access his own money. Outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan buzzed with life. Far below, in the shadows of gleaming skyscrapers, another world existed, one of struggle, poverty, and forgotten dreams. It was a world Farid rarely acknowledged, protected as he was by luxury cars, private elevators, and security teams that ensured he never had to witness the harsh realities of American inequality. But today, those 2 worlds were about to collide in the most unexpected way. A small figure was already making her way through the building's service corridors, driven by hunger and desperation, carrying with her a gift that would change both their lives forever. Harper Martinez had been living on the streets of New York for 8 months, ever since the foster care system had failed her for the 3rd time. At just 10 years old, she had learned to navigate the city's underground world with the cunning of someone twice her age. Her small frame and innocent appearance were both a blessing and a curse. People either ignored her completely or tried to exploit her vulnerability. Today, hunger gnawed at her stomach with particular intensity. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, surviving only on water from public fountains and the occasional kindness of strangers. The December wind cut through her thin jacket as she studied the towering Chrysler building from across the street. She had discovered that office buildings often threw away perfectly good food, and the higher the floor, the better the leftovers from executive catering. Using skills she'd learned from other street kids, Harper slipped through a service entrance during a shift change. She moved like a shadow through the maze of service corridors, her bare feet silent against the cold concrete. Years of surviving in foster homes and on the streets had taught her to read people, to sense danger, and most importantly, to find opportunities where others saw only obstacles. The building's security system was sophisticated, but it was designed to keep out adult intruders, not a small child who could crawl through ventilation shafts and squeeze into spaces others couldn't reach. Harper had an unusual gift with technology. Computers, phones, electronic devices all seemed to make sense to her in ways that amazed the few adults who had bothered to notice. In the public library, during the brief periods when she wasn't running from social workers, she would spend hours teaching herself programming languages and studying cybersecurity forums. As she made her way up through the building's service areas, Harper could hear raised voices coming from an executive office. Curiosity overcame caution, and she pressed her ear to a maintenance panel. Through the thin metal, she could hear men speaking in frustrated tones, mentioning words like encrypted, security breach, and deadline. Her empty stomach cramped painfully, reminding her of her original mission. Maybe these rich executives would have leftover sandwiches from a business meeting. Maybe someone would take pity on a hungry child. It was worth the risk. With practiced stealth, Harper located an air vent that led directly into the executive office. She had done this dozens of times before. Most adults were so absorbed in their own problems that they rarely looked up. She carefully removed the vent cover and lowered herself into what appeared to be the most luxurious office she had ever seen. The room was a temple to wealth and power. Original artwork adorned the walls. The carpet was so thick she sank into it, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a palace. But what caught her attention immediately was the group of well-dressed men standing around a large steel safe their expensive equipment scattered around like toys that had stopped working. Harper's analytical mind quickly assessed the situation. The men were clearly struggling with some kind of electronic lock system. She could see LED displays, circuit boards, and diagnostic equipment, all things that she instinctively understood, despite never having formal training. Years of tinkering with discarded electronics in dumpsters behind computer repair shops had given her an intuitive grasp of how these systems worked. The man in the center appeared to be in charge. His tailored suit probably cost more than most people made in a year, and his demeanor radiated the kind of authority that came from never being told no. This had to be Farid Al-Zahra, whose name she had seen on building directories and news articles during her library research sessions. For a moment, Harper hesitated. She could probably slip back into the vent unnoticed, but her hunger was overwhelming, and something about the challenge presented by that electronic safe intrigued her brilliant mind. Against her better judgment, she stepped forward into the light. The silence in the room was deafening when Harper stepped out from behind the massive mahogany desk. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward her in complete shock. 5 security technicians in expensive suits, and 1 billionaire who looked like he had seen a ghost. "Security breach," Marcus shouted, reaching for his radio. "How did a child get past—" "Wait!" Farid raised his hand, his dark eyes studying the small intruder with a mixture of amazement and irritation. "How did you get in here, child?" Harper's stomach growled audibly, answering for her. She looked up at the towering man, her blue eyes meeting his without fear. Years of surviving in a world that had repeatedly failed her had stripped away any intimidation she might have felt in the presence of wealth and power. "I'm hungry," she said simply, her voice clear despite her small size. "I was looking for food, but—" Her gaze drifted to the open safe door and the complex electronic panel that had stumped the experts. "I can see you guys are having some computer problems." The technicians exchanged glances that ranged from amused to insulted. Marcus stepped forward, his voice condescending. "Little girl, this is a military-grade security system worth more than most people's houses. You should probably—" "It's a Mosler double guard with quantum encryption," Harper interrupted, studying the LED display from across the room. "The problem isn't the lock mechanism, it's probably a cascading authentication failure in the biometric overlay. You're trying to force a manual override when you should be resetting the temporal sequencing." The room fell silent. Even Farid, accustomed to being the smartest person in any room, found himself staring at this homeless child who had just diagnosed a problem his team of experts couldn't solve. "That's actually a very astute observation," whispered Dr. Chen, the cybersecurity specialist, who had been flown in from Silicon Valley specifically for this job. "But how could you possibly know about quantum encryption protocols?" Harper shrugged, her attention still focused on the safe's display panel. "I read a lot. Library computers are free, and there are forums where people discuss this stuff." She paused, her stomach cramping again. "Look, give me some food and I'll open your safe for you." The suggestion hung in the air like an impossibility. Marcus laughed first, a sharp bark of disbelief. "Sir, with all due respect, we should call child services and—" "Give me food and I'll open the safe for you," Harper repeated, her voice stronger this time. Farid Al-Zahra began to laugh, a deep, rich sound that filled the enormous office. The idea was so absurd, so completely ridiculous, that he couldn't help himself. His 5-man team of experts, each earning more per hour than most people made in a week, joined in the laughter. The sound echoed off the marble walls and original Picasso paintings, creating a chorus of educated dismissal. But Harper didn't flinch. She had heard this kind of laughter before, from foster parents who thought she was lying about her abilities, from teachers who couldn't believe a homeless kid understood advanced mathematics, from social workers who saw only another damaged child instead of recognizing her extraordinary mind. When the laughter died down, Farid wiped tears from his eyes. The stress of the morning, combined with the sheer impossibility of the situation, had pushed him toward hysteria. Here was a homeless child, probably no more than 10 years old, claiming she could solve a problem that had defeated some of the world's leading security experts. "All right, little genius," he said, his voice still tinged with amusement. "If you can open that safe, if you can actually do what these 5 men with their degrees and expensive equipment cannot do, I'll give you $100 million. The number hung in the air, like a challenge, a jest, a promise that everyone in the room knew was impossible to fulfill. $100 million to a homeless child who probably had never seen $100 in her entire life. Harper looked at him seriously, her small hands already moving toward the safe's control panel. Deal. The atmosphere in the room shifted from amusement to uncomfortable silence as Harper approached the imposing safe. Marcus stepped forward instinctively, his protective instincts kicking in despite the absurdity of the situation. "Sir, we really shouldn't let a child near equipment worth—" "Let her try," Farid interrupted, settling back into his leather chair with the air of someone about to watch an entertaining performance. "What's the worst that could happen? She breaks something that's already broken." Harper ignored the adult's conversation, her entire focus narrowing to the electronic display panel before her. Up close, she could see details that the technicians had missed. Subtle patterns in the error codes, the way certain LED indicators flickered in specific sequences, the barely audible humming of processors working overtime to maintain security protocols. Her mind, trained by years of necessity to process information quickly and find solutions others missed, began to see the problem differently than the experts had. Where they saw a sophisticated security system, she saw an electronic puzzle with logical patterns and predictable responses. "The quantum encryption isn't the real problem," she murmured, more to herself than to the watching adults. "It's a red herring. The system is designed to make you think that's where the failure is occurring." Dr. Chen leaned forward despite himself. "What do you mean?" Harper's small fingers traced the air above the display panel, careful not to touch anything yet. "See how these error codes are cycling? They're not random. There's a pattern. Every 47 seconds, the sequence repeats. That's not encryption failure. That's a memory buffer overflow in the authentication subroutine." The silence in the room grew thicker. Even Farid found himself leaning forward, his amusement slowly being replaced by genuine curiosity. How could a homeless child possibly understand concepts that his highly paid experts were struggling with? "You're saying the lock mechanism isn't actually broken?" Marcus asked, his professional pride warring with growing amazement. "Right. The safe is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, protecting against intrusion. But someone changed something in the access protocols recently, didn't they?" Harper turned to look at Farid directly. "You upgraded something. Maybe added new biometric scanners. Updated the software." Farid's eyes widened. 3 days ago, his security team had installed new retinal scanners as part of a company-wide security upgrade. How could this child possibly know that? "The new biometric system is trying to integrate with the old quantum encryption, but they're running on different temporal frameworks," Harper continued, her voice gaining confidence as the solution became clearer in her mind. "Every time you try to authenticate, the new system sends verification requests faster than the old system can process them. So the old system locks down to protect against what it perceives as a brute force attack." The room was dead silent, except for the soft humming of air conditioning and the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic 42 floors below. Dr. Chen's face had gone pale, and Marcus was staring at Harper as if she had just spoken in an alien language that somehow made perfect sense. "That's," Dr. Chen whispered, "that's actually brilliant and completely correct. The temporal mismatch between authentication protocols would create exactly this kind of cascading failure." Harper nodded, her attention already shifting to potential solutions. "So you don't need to break the encryption or override the lock. You just need to synchronize the two systems. But," she paused, studying the display more carefully, "the manual controls aren't designed for that kind of adjustment. You'd need to access the root programming, which requires administrative access that we don't have," Marcus finished, his voice heavy with defeat. "The manufacturer's backdoor codes expired last month, and we can't get new ones until—" "You don't need backdoor codes," Harper interrupted. "You need to think like the system. What would make it voluntarily reset its own temporal framework?" She began to move around the safe, examining it from different angles. Her small size allowed her to see details at levels the adults couldn't easily access. Cable connections near the floor, ventilation patterns that might indicate internal component placement, tiny indicator lights that were barely visible from standing height. "Emergency protocols," she murmured, crouching down to examine a small panel near the base of the safe. "Every system has them. Something that would make it prioritize access over security in a life-threatening situation." Farid found himself genuinely impressed, despite his skepticism. "And you think you can trigger these emergency protocols?" Harper looked up at him, her young face serious. "Maybe, But I need to understand something first. What's actually in this safe that's so important? You need it opened in the next... She glanced at the wall clock, 2 hours and 15 minutes. The question caught Farid off guard. He had become so focused on the technical challenge that he had momentarily forgotten about the merger deadline that had created this crisis in the first place. Legal documents, he admitted, contracts for a business deal that needs to be signed today, or my company loses a $3 billion acquisition opportunity. Harper nodded thoughtfully. So this isn't just about proving a point or showing off. There are real consequences if this doesn't work. Very real consequences. Thousands of jobs, multiple companies, futures. Investors who trust me to deliver on my promises. Farid's voice carried the weight of genuine responsibility. Wait, that's why I hired the best security specialist money could buy. Harper looked around the room at the expensive equipment, the highly credentialed experts, the luxurious office that cost more to furnish than most people earned in a lifetime. Then she looked down at her own torn clothes, her bare feet, her empty stomach that hadn't seen food in 2 days. The best money can buy, she repeated quietly. But sometimes the best solutions don't come from money. She stood up, decision made. Okay, I'm going to try something, but I need everyone to step back and let me work. No questions, no suggestions, no interruptions. These systems are designed to detect multiple user inputs as potential security threats. The adults exchanged glances. Allowing a homeless child to potentially damage millions of dollars worth of equipment went against every instinct they had, but they were out of options, and something about Harper's confident manner was beginning to convince them that she might actually know what she was doing. If you break anything, Marcus began, then you'll be exactly where you are now, Harper finished. Locked out of your own safe with a deadline you can't meet. The only difference is you'll have someone to blame who can't afford to pay you back. Farid raised his hand to silence his team. Do it. Harper approached the safe with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to solve problems through observation rather than formal training. The watching adults stepped back as requested, forming a semicircle around her like spectators at a performance they didn't quite understand but couldn't look away from. Her small hands moved over the control panel with surprising confidence, not touching anything yet, but studying the layout with the intensity of a chess master, planning multiple moves ahead. The LED display continued its rhythmic cycling of error codes, each repetition a reminder of the expensive failure surrounding her. The emergency protocols I mentioned, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the safe's electronic humming, they're not documented in the user manuals. Manufacturers build them in for liability reasons, but they don't advertise them because it would compromise security. Dr. Chen found himself leaning forward despite his professional skepticism. How could you possibly know about undocumented features? Harper's lips curved in the faintest smile, the first emotion she had shown since entering the room. When you're homeless, you learn to find hidden things, food behind restaurants, warm places to sleep, electrical outlets that aren't supposed to be accessible. Electronic systems are just another environment to navigate. She began to work, her movements deliberate and measured. Instead of attacking the main control panel that had frustrated the experts, she focused on seemingly unrelated components, the ventilation sensors, the battery backup indicators, the temperature monitoring system. What are you doing? Marcus couldn't help asking, his professional curiosity overriding his instructions to remain silent. Creating a controlled emergency, Harper replied without looking up. The safe's programming has hierarchical priorities. Security is priority 1, but system preservation is priority 0, the foundational directive that overrides everything else. Her fingers found a small auxiliary panel that the technicians had dismissed as unimportant. With precise movements, she began to manipulate settings that controlled the safe's internal environment. Temperature readings began to fluctuate. Humidity sensors registered anomalous data. The safe's internal diagnostics started detecting what appeared to be environmental threats to its delicate electronic components. You're tricking it into thinking it's in danger, Farid realized, his business mind recognizing the elegance of the strategy. But won't that trigger additional security lockdowns? Only if the threat appears to be external, Harper explained, her concentration never wavering. But if the threat seems to be internal system failure, the emergency protocols prioritize preserving data integrity over maintaining security. The safe would rather risk unauthorized access than lose the data it's supposed to protect. The logic was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to break through the safe's defenses, Harper was convincing it to lower those defenses voluntarily. She was speaking to the system in its own language, exploiting programming assumptions that the designers had never expected a 10-year-old to understand. Warning lights began to flash on the main display. New error messages appeared, not the repetitive authentication failures the technicians had been fighting, but urgent alerts about environmental conditions and system stability. The safe's internal processors shifted into emergency mode, running diagnostic subroutines that hadn't been activated since the initial installation. "This is either genius or complete disaster," Marcus whispered to Dr. Chen. "Both," Chen replied, his voice filled with admiration and terror. "If she's right, we're about to witness the most unconventional safe-cracking in history. If she's wrong..." Harper's hands moved faster now, making minute adjustments to multiple systems simultaneously. She was orchestrating a symphony of controlled chaos, each element carefully calculated to push the safe's programming toward the tipping point where security protocols would yield to preservation instincts. The temperature readings spiked. Humidity sensors screamed warnings. Power consumption indicators showed dangerous fluctuations that suggested imminent hardware failure. To the safe's artificial intelligence, it appeared that catastrophic system failure was imminent, the kind of failure that could destroy not only the locking mechanisms, but also the precious data stored within. "Now comes the critical moment," Harper murmured, her small hands hovering over a sequence of controls. "I need to convince the system that the only way to preserve data integrity is to unlock and allow manual extraction of contents before complete system failure occurs." She began entering a complex sequence of commands, not into the main control panel, but into the environmental management system. Each keystroke was deliberate, building toward a conclusion that existed only in her remarkably gifted mind. The safe's behavior began to change. The rhythmic cycling of error codes became erratic. Warning alarms that had been silent for the 3 hours of expert attempts suddenly began to sound. Emergency lighting activated inside the vault, visible through the small window in the door. "Emergency data preservation mode," Harper announced with satisfaction. "The system is now prioritizing content protection over access restriction." But even as she spoke, new challenges presented themselves. The safe's programming was more sophisticated than she had initially realized. Emergency protocols were activating, but they were triggering additional security measures she hadn't anticipated. Backup systems were coming online, redundant locks were engaging, and the entire system seemed to be preparing for a complete shutdown rather than an emergency unlock. "It's fighting back," she realized, her confidence flickering for the first time. "The emergency protocols are more complex than I thought. There are multiple layers of programming conflicting with each other." Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the office's air conditioning. She had committed to a path that was rapidly becoming more complicated than she had anticipated. The adults watching her could sense the shift in her demeanor, the first signs of uncertainty creeping into her previously confident approach. Fareed checked his watch. 53 minutes until his deadline. His entire business empire hung in the balance, dependent on a homeless child who might have overestimated her abilities. The irony wasn't lost on him. He commanded resources that could influence global markets. Yet his fate was now in the hands of someone society had completely abandoned. "Can you still do this?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying genuine concern rather than pressure. Harper looked up at him, her young face reflecting a maturity born of surviving in a world that had repeatedly underestimated her. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "This is more complex than anything I've attempted before. But..." She turned back to the control panel. "I've never had anything worth $100 million depending on my success, either." The admission hung in the air between them. Part confidence, part confession. Entirely human. She was just a child, after all. Despite her extraordinary abilities, a child who was hungry, alone, and carrying burdens that no 10-year-old should have to bear. But she was also something else. Someone who had learned to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. Someone who had survived by being smarter and more resourceful than the system that had failed her. And now, for the first time in her short, difficult life, her unique gifts might actually be rewarded instead of ignored. The safe's electronic systems were now in full emergency mode. creating a cacophony of warning sounds and flashing lights that transformed Farid's elegant office into something resembling a space mission control center during a crisis. Harper stood before the chaotic display, her small frame dwarfed by the massive vault, but her mind working at a level that amazed even the seasoned experts watching her. "The problem is architectural," she announced, her voice cutting through the electronic noise. The safe's designers anticipated someone might try to trigger emergency protocols, so they built in conflict resolution systems. When emergency preservation mode activates, it simultaneously triggers enhanced security protocols as a countermeasure. Dr. Chen stepped closer, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by professional fascination. "So the system is essentially fighting itself." "Exactly. Think of it like having two different parts of your brain giving you opposite instructions at the same time." Harper's explanation was simple enough for everyone to understand, despite the complex technical concepts involved. The security subsystem is screaming, "Lock everything down," while the preservation subsystem is screaming, "Protect the data at all costs." The safe is paralyzed by its own conflicting directives. Marcus looked at his expensive diagnostic equipment scattered across the marble floor, equipment that had failed to identify this fundamental design flaw. "So what do we do? How do we resolve the conflict?" Harper's eyes remained fixed on the display, her mind racing through possibilities. Years of living on the streets had taught her that when two powerful forces were in conflict, sometimes the solution wasn't to choose a side, but to find a third option that satisfied both. "We don't resolve the conflict," she said slowly, a new idea taking shape. "We escalate it." The adults exchanged worried glances. Farid's deadline was approaching rapidly, and the suggestion to make things worse rather than better seemed counterintuitive at best, dangerous at worst. "Explain," Farid commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making billion-dollar decisions based on incomplete information. Harper's hands moved to a different section of the control panel, one that none of the technicians had paid attention to during their hours of failed attempts. Every conflict resolution system has a breaking point, a level of contradiction that forces it to reset to factory defaults rather than continue operating in an inconsistent state. She began entering commands that seemed designed to make the safe's condition worse rather than better. Environmental readings became even more erratic. System diagnostics reported cascading failures across multiple subsystems. The conflict between security and preservation protocols intensified to a level that the safe's programming had never been designed to handle. "You're creating a logic bomb," Dr. Chen realized, his voice filled with equal parts admiration and horror, forcing the system into a state where it has no choice but to completely restart its decision-making process. "More than that," Harper replied, her concentration absolute. "So I'm creating a situation where maintaining current security protocols would guarantee the destruction of the data the safe is designed to protect. When that happens, the preservation directive will override everything else, including the architectural safeguards against emergency access." The theory was elegant, but the execution was incredibly risky. If Harper miscalculated, she could trigger a complete system shutdown that would lock the safe permanently, making it impossible to access the contents without physically destroying the vault, a process that would take days and likely damage the documents inside. Farid watched the young girl work with a mixture of amazement and growing respect. He had built his fortune by recognizing talent wherever it appeared, but he had never imagined finding it in a homeless child who had broken into his office. Her approach to problem-solving was unlike anything he had encountered in decades of business negotiations and technical challenges. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier amusement. Harper paused for a moment, her hands still moving across the controls, but her attention briefly shifting to the question. "Foster care," she said simply. "When you're passed between families who don't want you, you learn to read situations quickly. You learn to find solutions that work for everyone involved, because if you don't, you end up back in the system." The honesty of her answer cut through the tension in the room. Here was a child who had been failed by every support system designed to protect her, yet she had developed problem-solving skills that surpassed those of highly educated professionals. The irony wasn't lost on any of the adults present. As the families who had you, Farid found himself asking, did they recognize your abilities? A shadow crossed Harper's young face. Most people see what they expect to see. A poor kid, a problem to be solved or ignored. They don't look for intelligence in places where they don't expect to find it. Her words carried no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who had learned to navigate a world that consistently undervalued her. But there was something else in her voice, a quiet determination that suggested her experiences had strengthened rather than broken her. The safe systems reached a critical point. Warning messages flooded the display faster than the human eye could read them. Emergency protocols and security protocols were now in direct, irreconcilable conflict, creating a digital stalemate that the safe's programming couldn't resolve through normal means. "This is it," Harper announced, her small hands positioned over a final sequence of commands. "In about 30 seconds, the system is going to face a choice: maintain security protocols and risk complete data loss, or prioritize data preservation and temporarily suspend security measures." She looked up at Farid, her blue eyes reflecting a maturity that seemed impossible for someone her age. "But I need you to understand something. If this works, I didn't just get lucky or stumble onto the solution. I earned it. Every night sleeping in doorways, every day figuring out how to survive, every hour spent in libraries teaching myself things that schools never had time to show me. All of that brought me to this moment." Farid nodded slowly, beginning to understand that he was witnessing something far more significant than a technical solution to a mechanical problem. This was a demonstration of human potential that had been ignored, dismissed, and nearly lost to a system that failed to recognize talent outside of traditional boundaries. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I want you to know that regardless of what happens in the next few minutes, you've already proven something important today." Harper smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness she had shown since entering the office. Then she turned back to the control panel and executed the final sequence of commands that would determine whether her theory was brilliant insight or catastrophic error. The safe's displays went dark. Every warning light, every diagnostic indicator, every electronic sound ceased simultaneously. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the massive vault sat in complete silence, its fate hanging in the balance of programming logic that no human had ever tested under these conditions. Then, with a soft electronic chime that sounded almost musical in the sudden quiet, the safe's massive door clicked open. The soft click of the safe door opening echoed through the office like a gunshot in the absolute silence that followed. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. The adults stared at the slightly ajar door as if it might be a mirage, while Harper stood perfectly still, her small chest rising and falling with the controlled breathing of someone who had just accomplished the impossible. Then reality crashed back into the room with explosive force. "Holy shit," Marcus whispered, forgetting his professional demeanor entirely. "She actually did it. A 10-year-old just solved a problem that 5 experts couldn't crack in 3 hours. Dr. Chen was already moving toward the safe, his scientific mind demanding verification of what his eyes had witnessed. "The door is completely unlocked. All security protocols have been suspended. The system has entered full preservation mode, granting unrestricted access to prevent potential data loss." Farid remained seated, his dark eyes fixed on Harper with an expression that had evolved from amusement through skepticism to something approaching awe. The child stood before his opened vault like David before Goliath's fallen form, small, unlikely, victorious against impossible odds. "The documents," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of $3 billion in implications. "Are they intact?" One of the technicians carefully opened the safe door fully, revealing the pristine interior with its organized shelves of legal files, contracts, and sensitive business documents. Everything was exactly as it had been when the lock first malfunctioned, preserved in climate-controlled perfection. "Everything appears undamaged," the technician reported. "The preservation protocols worked exactly as intended." Farid stood slowly, his movements deliberate as he processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. A homeless child had not only saved his business deal, but had demonstrated a level of technical understanding that challenged everything he thought he knew about intelligence, education, and human potential. $100 million, he said, the words hanging in the air like a promise that everyone had forgotten was real until this moment. Harper turned to face him, her expression serious despite her youth. "You were joking when you said that." "I was," Farid admitted, "but I'm not joking now." The room fell silent again as the implications sank in. $100 million was more money than most people could comprehend, let alone a homeless child who had been surviving on scraps and sleeping in doorways. It was enough money to transform not just Harper's life, but the lives of thousands of others. But Harper didn't react with excitement or disbelief. Instead, she studied Farid's face with the same analytical intensity she had applied to the safe's electronic systems. "Why?" she asked simply. The question caught everyone off guard. Dr. Chen and Marcus exchanged glances, clearly expecting the child to be overwhelmed with gratitude or excitement. Instead, she was interrogating the offer with the skepticism of someone who had learned not to trust promises from adults. "Because you earned it," Farid replied. "You solved a problem that threatened my company, saved a business deal worth billions, and demonstrated abilities that frankly shame the expensive consultants I usually rely on." Harper shook her head slightly. "Those are business reasons. You're a businessman. You understand return on investment, cost-benefit analysis, strategic value. Paying me $100 million for a few minutes of work doesn't make business sense, no matter how valuable the outcome." Her insight was uncomfortably accurate. Farid had become successful by making calculated decisions based on clear strategic thinking, not emotional gestures or impulsive generosity. The child's ability to see through his motives to the underlying questions was as impressive as her technical skills had been. "You're right," he acknowledged. "So let me give you a different answer. I'm offering you this money because I see potential that has been wasted by every system designed to nurture it. You're brilliant, resourceful, and capable of things that people twice your age with expensive educations couldn't accomplish. But more than that, you represent something I had forgotten about, which is that sometimes the most valuable solutions come from the places we least expect to find them." Farid moved closer to the window, gazing down at the Manhattan streets where Harper had been surviving just hours earlier. "I built my fortune by identifying undervalued assets and investing in their potential. You're the most undervalued asset I've ever encountered." Harper followed his gaze to the window, looking down at the world she knew intimately, a world of cold doorways, empty stomachs, and people who looked through her as if she didn't exist. "And what do you expect in return?" she asked, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who had learned that every offer came with strings attached. "Nothing," Farid said, surprising himself with the honesty of his answer. "This isn't an investment with expected returns. It's recognition of value that already exists but has been ignored." The other adults in the room listened to this exchange with growing amazement. They were witnessing something unprecedented, not just a business transaction, but a moment of recognition between two minds that operated on levels most people never reached. "I don't think you understand what you're offering," Harper said quietly. $100 million isn't just money. It's power, influence, the ability to change systems instead of just surviving them. Are you really prepared to give that to a homeless kid? The question revealed depths of understanding that went far beyond her years. Harper wasn't just thinking about personal benefit. She was considering the broader implications of sudden, enormous wealth. She understood that money wasn't just purchasing power, but social influence, political leverage, and the ability to reshape the very systems that had failed her. Farid studied her carefully. In the space of a few hours, this remarkable child had challenged every assumption he held about intelligence, potential, and social value. Now she was demonstrating a level of wisdom about power and responsibility that many adults never achieved. "Maybe that's exactly what the world needs," he said thoughtfully. "Someone who understands systems from the bottom up, who has experienced firsthand what happens when those systems fail people. Someone who has the intelligence to design better solutions and now the resources to implement them." Harper was quiet for a long moment, her young mind processing implications that reached far beyond her personal circumstances. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a maturity that seemed to transform the air in the room. "If I accept this, I won't just be helping myself. I'll be responsible for using this opportunity to help other people like me, kids who are forgotten, ignored, written off by systems that don't see their potential." "I would expect nothing less," Farid replied. The conversation had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. What had begun as a jest about payment for services rendered was becoming a dialogue about social responsibility, systemic change, and the obligation that comes with unexpected opportunity. Harper looked around the luxurious office, taking in the artwork that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, the furniture that represented casual wealth beyond her previous imagination, the view of a city that contained both unprecedented luxury and devastating poverty. "I'll need help," she said finally. "I know how to survive, and apparently I know how to solve technical problems. But I don't know how to manage the kind of resources you're talking about." "That can be arranged," Fareed assured her. "Financial advisors, legal counsel, educational opportunities. Whatever you need to transform potential into lasting impact. And you'll expect nothing in return. No control over how I use the money. No influence over the decisions I make." Fareed smiled, recognizing in her questions the same strategic thinking that had made him successful in business. "I'll expect you to use your gifts wisely. Beyond that, the choices are yours to make." Harper walked slowly toward the open safe, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet as she approached the vault that had just changed the trajectory of her life. The adults watched her with a mixture of fascination and respect, recognizing that they were witnessing something historic, not just the solution to a technical problem, but the emergence of a force that could reshape the very foundations of how society recognized and nurtured human potential. "Before I give you my answer," she said, her small hand resting on the safe's steel door, "I need you to understand what your offer really means, not just to me, but to everyone like me." She turned back to face the room, her blue eyes moving from person to person as she spoke. "There are thousands of kids living on the streets right now, kids with gifts that nobody recognizes because they're too busy surviving to demonstrate them in ways that matter to the people with power. Kids who could solve problems you haven't even thought of yet, if they just had the chance." Dr. Chen found himself leaning forward, captivated by the depth of her perspective. "You're talking about systematic change, not just individual success." "Exact. One person escaping poverty is a feel-good story. One person using their escape to create pathways for others. That's revolution." Harper's voice carried conviction that seemed impossible for someone her age. Your $100 million doesn't just buy my freedom. It buys the responsibility to prove that intelligence exists everywhere, not just in places where people expect to find it." Marcus, who had spent the morning frustrated by his inability to solve a problem this child had cracked in minutes, spoke up. "What would you do? Specifically, I mean, how would you use resources like that to create the kind of change you're talking about?" Harper's response revealed that she had been thinking about these questions long before she had ever imagined having the resources to address them. "Education first, but not traditional education. The current system failed me and fails thousands of others every year. We need learning environments that recognize different types of intelligence, different ways of processing information, different life experiences that can contribute to problem solving." She began to pace, her mind clearly racing as she articulated ideas that had been forming throughout her difficult experiences. "Second, we need to change how society identifies potential. Right now, we look for intelligence in people who already have advantages, good schools, stable families, economic security. But what about the kid who figures out how to hack free internet because she can't afford it? Or the one who develops survival strategies that would impress military tacticians? That's intelligence too. It's just not the kind that shows up on standardized tests." Fareed watched her with growing admiration. This wasn't just a bright child with technical skills. This was a visionary who understood systems thinking at a level that most graduate students never achieved. "Third," Harper continued, "say we need to create pathways that don't require people to abandon their communities to succeed. Most programs for gifted kids from disadvantaged backgrounds essentially say, prove you can fit into our world. What if instead we said, show us how your world has taught you things ours never could?" The room was completely silent, except for the distant hum of Manhattan traffic. Even the safe's electronic systems had reset to their normal, quiet operation. Harper's words were reshaping how everyone present thought about intelligence, opportunity, and social responsibility. "You've thought about this a lot," Fareed observed. "I've lived it. Every day on the streets is a masterclass in resource optimization, risk assessment, and creative problem-solving, but none of that matters to people who make decisions about who gets opportunities and who doesn't." Harper's voice carried no bitterness, just the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who had learned to navigate systemic bias. "Until now," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Maybe, if I'm smart enough to use this opportunity correctly." Harper looked directly at Fareed. "That's why I need to know what you really expect. Because once I accept this money, I'm not just responsible to myself anymore. I'm responsible to every kid who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or written off. Farid stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a legal pad and pen. What if we make this formal? Not just a promise, but a contract that protects both your independence and your commitment to the principles you're describing. What kind of contract? One that transfers the money to you with no strings attached, but also establishes a foundation dedicated to identifying and nurturing intelligence wherever it appears. You would control the foundation, determine its priorities, and have complete authority over its operations. Harper studied his face carefully. And your role would be advisory, if you want it, financial, if you need it, but not controlling. The decisions would be yours to make. For the first time since opening the safe, Harper showed signs of her actual age. The weight of the conversation, the magnitude of the opportunity, and the pressure of representing so many others like herself were clearly overwhelming her young mind. This is scary, she admitted quietly. A few hours ago, I was just trying to find something to eat. Now you're talking about changing how society works. Marcus stepped forward, his earlier frustration replaced by genuine respect. Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person for this responsibility. Someone who remembers what it's like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to have potential that nobody recognizes. And someone, Dr. Chen added, who has demonstrated that unconventional approaches can solve problems that traditional methods can't touch. Harper was quiet for several minutes, her young mind processing implications that reached far beyond her personal circumstances. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but thoughtful. If I do this, I want to start with something small but important. A pilot program that identifies kids with non-traditional intelligence and gives them resources to develop their gifts without forcing them to abandon their communities or conform to traditional academic models. How would you identify these kids? Farid asked, genuinely curious about her strategic thinking. The same way you identified me, by looking in places where people don't expect to find intelligence. Homeless shelters, juvenile detention centers, foster care systems, inner-city schools that have been written off, and by recognizing different types of problem-solving skills, not just academic performance. She moved to the window, looking down at the Manhattan streets with new eyes, not as a place of survival and struggle, but as a landscape of untapped potential waiting to be discovered. I want to prove that brilliance exists everywhere, not just in privileged environments, and I want to create pathways that celebrate different types of intelligence instead of trying to force everyone into the same mold. Farid joined her at the window. That's ambitious, revolutionary even. It has to be. Incremental change isn't enough when the fundamental assumptions are wrong. Harper's reflection in the glass showed someone far older than her 10 years, someone who had been transformed not just by opportunity, but by the recognition of her own power to create change. So, she said, turning back to face the room, let's talk about the details of this contract, because I think we're about to change some lives. The adults exchanged glances, recognizing that they were no longer dealing with a homeless child who had solved a technical problem, but with an emerging leader who understood both systemic failure and transformational possibility. The next hour would determine whether this moment became just an interesting story or the beginning of something that could reshape how society recognized and developed human potential. The next hour transformed Farid's office from a crisis management center into an impromptu war room for social change. Harper had accepted the offer, but with conditions that revealed her understanding of both opportunity and responsibility went far deeper than anyone had imagined. She wasn't just thinking about her own future. She was architecting a systematic approach to discovering and developing overlooked intelligence. I want the foundation structured so that traditional academic credentials aren't requirements for leadership positions, Harper explained, as Farid's legal team joined the discussion via video conference. Some of the smartest people I've met never finished high school, but they understand systems and human behavior in ways that PhD programs don't teach. The lawyers exchanged glances that Harper caught immediately. She had learned to read adult expressions during her time in foster care, the subtle signals that indicated when people were humoring a child rather than taking them seriously. I know what you're thinking, she said directly to the lead attorney on the screen. A 10-year-old wanting to hire people without degrees sounds naive, but consider this. I just solved a problem that stumped 5 experts with advanced degrees and expensive equipment. Maybe the issue isn't my understanding of qualifications, but your definition of them." The lawyer, Marcus Brennan, from Farid's primary legal firm, paused his note-taking. "That's actually a fair point. What alternative qualifications would you propose?" "Demonstrated problem-solving ability, evidence of innovative thinking under resource constraints, experience with populations that traditional social services have failed, and most importantly, genuine commitment to finding intelligence in unexpected places rather than just reinforcing existing hierarchies." Dr. Chen, who had remained in the office throughout the discussions, found himself taking notes. "You're essentially proposing a meritocracy based on results rather than credentials. That's actually brilliant, though it would be challenging to implement in practice." "Everything worth doing is challenging," Harper replied. "If it was easy, someone would have done it already." Farid watched this exchange with growing amazement. In the space of a few hours, Harper had not only demonstrated technical abilities that surpassed trained experts, but was now articulating organizational theories that challenged fundamental assumptions about how institutions should operate. Her experiences with systemic failure had given her insights that traditional education might never have provided. "Let's talk about the pilot program you mentioned," he said. "How would you actually identify these overlooked kids?" Harper's face lit up with enthusiasm, the first time she had shown excitement about anything since entering the office. "Street outreach, but not the traditional kind. Instead of just offering services, we'd be looking for specific indicators of intelligence that usually get overlooked." She moved to the whiteboard that dominated one wall of Farid's office, grabbing a marker and beginning to sketch out her ideas with the confidence of someone who had been thinking about these problems for years. Kids who've figured out how to access free Wi-Fi in places where it's not supposed to be available. Kids who've developed elaborate systems for avoiding detection by authority figures. Kids who understand social dynamics well enough to navigate complex family situations or street hierarchies. Kids who've taught themselves skills through trial and error because formal education wasn't available or didn't work for them. Her diagrams were simple but clear, showing interconnected systems that accounted for different types of intelligence and various pathways for development. The adults watching realized they were seeing strategic thinking that most graduate students would struggle to match. "The key," Harper continued, "is understanding that intelligence adapts to circumstances. A kid who's brilliant at survival might struggle with traditional academic tasks, not because they lack capability, but because their intelligence has been focused on more immediate needs." Marcus from the legal team spoke up again. "This approach would require significant resources for outreach and assessment. Have you considered the logistics?" "Constantly," Harper replied without hesitation. "That's why the foundation needs to be large enough to fund real programs, not just feel-good initiatives. We're talking about systematic change, which requires systematic resources." She turned back to the whiteboard, adding numbers and budget estimates that demonstrated she understood the financial implications of her vision. Initial outreach teams for 5 major cities, specialized assessment tools developed by people who understand non-traditional intelligence, mentorship programs that pair kids with adults who've succeeded despite similar backgrounds, and educational resources that adapt to different learning styles and life circumstances. Farid found himself impressed, not just by Harper's vision, but by her practical understanding of implementation challenges. "You've thought about this in remarkable detail for someone who just learned about the resources an hour ago." "I've been thinking about solutions to these problems my whole life," Harper said simply. "I just never had the resources to implement them before." Dr. Chen looked up from his notes. "What about resistance? Systems don't like to change, and there will be people who benefit from the current structure who won't appreciate your approach." Harper's expression grew serious. "Of course there will be resistance. People who've invested their careers in traditional gatekeeping won't want to admit that their methods have been missing talent. Institutions that profit from maintaining artificial scarcity of opportunity won't welcome programs that democratize access to advancement." She paused, looking around the room at the adults who were taking her seriously, perhaps the first adults who ever had. "But that's exactly why this work is necessary. When systems consistently fail to recognize talent, the problem isn't with the talent, it's with the systems. And systems can be changed if you have enough resources and enough determination." The legal team had been working on contract language while Harper outlined her vision, and Marcus returned to the discussion with preliminary terms. We've structured the foundation as an independent entity with Harper as the sole decision-making authority, advised by a board she selects. The initial funding would be the full $100 million, with Mr. Alzara having no control over operations or strategic decisions. What about accountability? Harper asked. How do we ensure the foundation actually accomplishes its mission instead of just becoming another ineffective bureaucracy? The question revealed yet another layer of her sophisticated thinking. She wasn't just focused on getting resources. She was thinking about how to prevent those resources from being wasted or corrupted over time. Our performance metrics, Farid suggested. Measurable outcomes that demonstrate real impact rather than just good intentions. Exactly. And regular assessment by the communities we're trying to serve, not just by academic or philanthropic institutions. Harper was clearly thinking through every aspect of how to maintain integrity and effectiveness over time. As the afternoon wore on, the scope of what they were planning became clear. This wasn't just a generous gift to a deserving child. It was the launch of a systematic challenge to how society identified, developed, and supported human potential. Harper's combination of personal experience, analytical intelligence, and strategic thinking was creating something unprecedented. There's one more thing, Harper said, as the contract discussions neared completion. I want part of the Foundation's work to include documentation and research. We need to prove that our approach works, and we need to share what we learn so other organizations can replicate and improve on our methods. Academic publication? Dr. Chen asked. Among other things, but also accessible communication that reaches people who don't read academic journals. The kids we're trying to help, their families, the community organizations that work with them. They need to understand that intelligence comes in many forms and that their experiences matter. The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long shadows across Farid's office as they finalized the details that would transform Harper from a homeless child into one of the youngest philanthropic leaders in history. But more than that, they were creating a foundation that could prove intelligence wasn't a rare commodity confined to privileged circumstances. It was a human capacity that flourished everywhere, waiting only for recognition and opportunity. Are you ready for this responsibility? Farid asked as they prepared to sign the final documents. Harper looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness, knowing that somewhere among those lights were thousands of children like her. Brilliant, resourceful, invisible to systems that didn't know how to see them. I've been ready my whole life, she said quietly. I just didn't know it until today. 6 months after that transformative day in Farid's office, Harper stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia University, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the National Conference on Educational Innovation. The irony wasn't lost on her. A year ago, she had been sleeping in doorways and scavenging for food. Now she was addressing some of the most influential educators and policymakers in the country. But this moment represented more than personal transformation. The Harper Foundation had already identified and supported 847 children with exceptional abilities in non-traditional circumstances. The pilot program had exceeded every projection, discovering mathematical prodigies in juvenile detention centers, engineering geniuses in homeless shelters, and strategic thinkers in foster care systems across 5 major cities. Ladies and gentlemen, Harper began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned to command attention through substance rather than credentials. I want to tell you about Maria Rodriguez, who developed a water purification system using materials from a junkyard because her family couldn't afford clean drinking water. About James Chen, who created an app that helps homeless individuals find safe sleeping locations and available resources because he spent 3 years living on the streets after aging out of foster care. About Aisha Williams, who designed a more efficient food distribution system for her neighborhood food bank because she understood hunger in ways that textbooks never teach. The audience was silent, captivated by stories that challenged every assumption they held about where intelligence originated and how it manifested. These young people weren't discovered through traditional academic screening or standardized testing. They were found because we looked in places where others saw only problems, and we recognized solutions where others saw only obstacles. In the front row, Farid watched with pride as the homeless child he had met in his office commanded the attention of some of the most educated people in America. The foundation had become everything they had envisioned and more. a systematic challenge to institutional bias that was producing measurable results. But tonight, I want to address a more fundamental question, Harper continued. What happens when society consistently fails to recognize intelligence because it appears in unexpected forms or inconvenient circumstances? She clicked to a slide showing statistics that had shocked even her. The number of children with extraordinary abilities who never received opportunities to develop them. The correlation between economic circumstances and educational access. The systematic barriers that prevented unconventional intelligence from being recognized. We lose innovations that could solve our greatest challenges. We waste human potential on a scale that should be considered a national emergency. We perpetuate systems that mistake privilege for ability and conformity for intelligence. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Harper had learned to read rooms during her months of advocacy, and she could see that her words were hitting their intended target, the comfortable assumptions that allowed educational inequality to persist. The Harper Foundation has proven that intelligence exists everywhere, not just in places where we expect to find it. Our young innovators have developed solutions to problems that traditional institutions have struggled with for decades, precisely because their experiences gave them perspectives that conventional education never could. She paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the challenge she had come here to present. So here's my question for all of you. Are you ready to change how your institutions operate? Are you prepared to look for intelligence in places where it's been invisible? Are you willing to admit that some of your traditional gatekeeping methods have been blocking exactly the kind of innovative thinking our society needs most? The silence in the auditorium was profound. Harper had just asked some of the most powerful people in education to acknowledge that their systems had fundamental flaws and to take responsibility for changing them. Because if you are, she continued, the Harper Foundation is ready to partner with you. We'll help you identify overlooked talent in your communities. We'll share the assessment methods we've developed for recognizing non-traditional intelligence. We'll provide resources to support young people whose brilliance doesn't fit conventional molds. She looked directly at the camera recording her speech, knowing that her words would reach far beyond this auditorium. And if you're not ready for that level of change, then you need to ask yourself a different question. How many more innovations will we lose? How many more brilliant minds will we waste before we finally admit that intelligence isn't a rare commodity confined to privileged circumstances? It's a human capacity that flourishes everywhere, waiting only for recognition and opportunity. The standing ovation that followed lasted 7 minutes. 2 years later, Harper stood in the rebuilt community center in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood, watching 12-year-old Marcus demonstrate the urban farming system he had designed, using recycled materials and solar panels salvaged from abandoned buildings. Around them, 43 young innovators from the Harper Foundation's expanded program were showcasing solutions to problems that ranged from affordable housing design to sustainable energy distribution. Fareed arrived for the quarterly foundation review, but these visits had evolved far beyond oversight. He came to witness what systematic change looked like when intelligence was recognized and nurtured regardless of its origins. The foundation now operated in 15 cities, had identified over 2,000 young innovators, and had influenced policy changes in educational institutions across 3 countries. Any regrets? He asked Harper, as they watched a 14-year-old former foster child explain her water conservation invention to a group of visiting engineers. Harper smiled, the same analytical expression she had worn when facing his locked safe, but now tempered with the satisfaction of someone whose vision had become reality. Only that it took so long to get started. The numbers told an extraordinary story. Foundation participants had filed 127 patents, started 34 successful businesses, and developed solutions to infrastructure problems that had stumped traditional institutions. But more importantly, they had proven that intelligence wasn't a rare commodity. It was a human capacity that flourished when given proper recognition and support. The real success, Harper reflected, isn't just what these kids have accomplished. It's that we've changed how people look for intelligence. School districts are revising their identification methods. Foster care systems are implementing new assessment tools. Even juvenile detention centers are recognizing that behavioral problems sometimes mask extraordinary analytical abilities. As the afternoon demonstration concluded, Harper addressed the assembled crowd of young innovators, community leaders, and visiting officials. 2 years ago, most of you were invisible to systems designed to identify and develop talent. Today, you're proving that brilliance exists everywhere. It just needed to be recognized and supported. She paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected every background and circumstance America contained. You've shown the world that intelligence isn't about where you come from or what advantages you've had. It's about how you think, how you solve problems, and how you use your abilities to make things better for others. The Harper Foundation had become more than a philanthropic organization. It had become proof that social transformation was possible when you changed the fundamental assumptions about human potential. Intelligence, it turned out, had always been everywhere. Society had finally learned how to see it. Harper Martinez changed the world because one person saw potential where others saw only poverty. Right now, in your community, there's another Harper, a brilliant child whose intelligence is invisible to the systems designed to find it. A young mind that could solve problems you haven't even imagined if someone just gave them the chance. The question isn't whether these kids exist. The question is whether you'll be the one to recognize them. Every day that passes, we lose innovations that could change everything. We waste potential that could transform communities. We overlook solutions to our biggest challenges because we're not looking in the right places. But you can change that. Share Harper's story. When people understand that intelligence appears everywhere, they start seeing it everywhere. Look differently. The next time you encounter a young person from difficult circumstances, ask yourself, what have they learned to do that textbooks don't teach? Demand better. Push your local schools and community programs to recognize different types of brilliance, not just traditional academic success. Because somewhere in your city tonight, there's a child with the mind to unlock solutions we desperately need. They're waiting for someone to see them, someone to believe in them, someone like you. Don't let the next Harper remain invisible. Share this story now. Change how we see potential.